Once upon a time, stories of fantasy. People suffering with OCD aren't living a fantasy. Even though there are a lot of myths that go around obsessive compulsive disorder, their stories are real. These are stories from the OCD side. Real people, real stories brought to you by FamilyOCD.com and InvisibleWheelchair.com. We want your story. Go to InvisibleWheelchair.com and contact us to tell us your story here. OCD is real. OCD treatments are real. OCD recovery is real. And so are these stories. Today I was able to interview an inspiring young woman. Her name is Sommer Grandchamp. Sommer has gone through the majority of her life having been misdiagnosed or just with confusion about what was happening with her mental health. It wasn't until she was 23 when she finally was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. That was when she was able to start turning her life around. She's here on the podcast to be able to tell her story. So let's go to that story and let's listen. Well, Sommer, thank you so much for being part of the Invisible Wheelchair podcast. I welcome you.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be joining you today.
So I know you have such a passion for being able to, one, tell your story, and two, to help others, and that's what this is all about, is helping others with OCD. So if you would, tell us a little bit about your story of what went on for you and possibly how you got past it and were able to turn it around.
So I have an interesting story, mainly because I have such a big gap of misdiagnosis. So I actually started showing OCD symptoms when I was around 11. My very first memory that I can think of from having OCD was, when I was 11 years old in 7th grade, and I became just so fearful of vomiting in public. And so that was kind of my first big spike that I noticed. And because I was so young, I had a really hard time understanding what was going on and having the ability to articulate how I was feeling to like a parent or a teacher. And so what ended up happening during this very first spike that I was having is I ended up in the nurse's office pretty much every day at school, and I ended up missing quite a lot of school. My diagnosis at the time, as my parents were kind of trying to figure out what was going on, was lactose intolerance, which is funny. So I was really, really struggling, and I just couldn't articulate what was going on. And all I knew was, okay, I guess I'm lactose intolerant. So there was no actually action plan other than what you would give to someone who's lactose intolerant. And as an 11-year-old, I was just really confused. I think something that's interesting about OCD is that was kind of my first experience with it. And then I jumped kind of right into another spike the following year that was so completely different. It had nothing to do with vomit. I became really, really afraid of harming myself. And so it kind of moved into harm OCD, which is a really different, I think the brain patterns are so similar, but it feels very different, especially being so young. The way that I was able to explain how I was feeling to my parents didn't seem like there were parallels between the so-called lactose intolerance and this new fear of harming myself. And so obviously both were causing a whole lot of distress. At the time, we didn't know exactly where to take me to kind of help with that. So my first experience with trying to go to a therapist happened after that second OCD spike that I was having with the harm OCD. My parents took me to my primary care physician, and they gave me, I remember, a piece of pink paper, and it had a 10-question questionnaire for me to answer. And based on my answers, they said either she has OCD or she's totally fine, nothing's wrong.
Wow. Black and white.
Yeah, exactly. And the questions, I think, were very, very, what you would think of as like a textbook OCD, which I didn't have at that time. So it was, are you, washing your hands over and over, things like that were very the common perception of what OCD is. And at that time, my answer was pretty much no to all of those typical symptoms. I was, I kind of totally got off that path. So that was from the time I was 12, and I never thought again that I had OCD. I never like ventured into that concept until I was 23 years old and actually got diagnosed with it. So over, a span of 12 years of different misdiagnoses, and I had just a lot of struggles. I had to drop out of the honors program at school because I was having just such a hard time concentrating. And so then, of course, they thought maybe she has ADHD. So I just went through a plethora of all of these diagnoses. And thankfully, I ended up seeing a therapist when I was 23. I had a big kind of mental burnout after I had ventured out of corporate world, and I decided I wanted to start my own company, kind of celebrating women in the workplace. And so I put on my very first women's business conference, and I'm from Denver, Colorado. And so it was called Empower Denver. And we had over 100 people come. It was wonderful and so fun, but I did it all on my own. And it really exacerbated my OCD symptoms to such a height that after the conference, I completely crashed. And I'm so actually grateful for that, because it drove me to go back into therapy. And the therapist that I saw finally said, wow, you know what? You have a lot of OCD symptoms. I think that's what's going on. And so, that from that time that I got my diagnosis at 23, I'm now 26. And in the span of 3 years, my life has improved so much, because I've gone through multiple forms of therapy. I've met other people who have OCD. That's been extremely helpful, because it can feel so isolating, especially when you have just really disturbing thoughts that are popping up. It can feel like you're the only one, and it's not something that feels comfortable to share with other people. But thankfully, as I've met other people who have OCD, I've been able to kind of share stories and learn, oh, hey, I'm not alone. And maybe I'm not totally crazy, or maybe I am, but maybe there's many of us that are. So
it's a big group.
Yeah, there's a large group of us. And that's been such a blessing, is just meeting other people who have OCD. And then most recently, the biggest help has been going through ERP therapy, which I just started in 2020. Of course, 2020 is a tough year for a gal with OCD. Yeah, so that's kind of my story, how I finally got there. But what I became so passionate about throughout the whole process was just the way that I think in society, we don't have a great way to articulate our feelings. And there's a lot of just taboo topics that feel super uncomfortable to talk about. And I think it really holds people back from, from kids from getting the right diagnosis, or parents from being able to help. Like just simply knowing what questions to ask a child to explain their emotions, or an adult, because it's really hard to explain as an adult too. I mean, I practice this every day, all day, and I still get really tripped up with trying to articulate how I'm feeling. So that's what I've become really passionate about, and kind of have put some of my energy towards, is just trying to spread the word about, like, how can we help people become more aware of how they're feeling, and then articulate that to others so they can relate.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you, how did it affect your confidence and your emotional state when being misdiagnosed, especially, and feeling, I would imagine, feeling a little bit like you're crazy, because you're feeling this, but nobody's seeing it or being able to understand it. So how did you see that happen for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My response to being diagnosed, I think, was counterintuitive. I actually cried happiness tears, because I finally understood what was going on. Because for all of those years that I had been misdiagnosed, and people just couldn't figure out what was going on, the thought in the back of my mind was always just, gosh, am I just really bad at life as compared to other people? Am I just, is everybody having this going on, and they just somehow can handle it better than I can? And I just really didn't understand, because it really impacted, of course, my relationships, my confidence, my schoolwork, my work life. I mean, it really kind of intrudes on every single part of your life. I mean, just like the tiniest little things that I would do that no one else would think about, like getting into my car and putting my seatbelt on, was such a mental, just a mental challenge trying to walk myself through from a harm OCD perspective. And I think I just assumed that because no one had ever diagnosed me correctly, that it must just be, I'm just bad at life, or I'm just bad in general. And so, yeah, so finding out I think a lot of people, if they think of being diagnosed, which is kind of a harsh word. I don't know why that, the word sounds kind of harsh, but they think of that being like a bad thing. For me, it was actually like so relieving. I walked out of there being like, okay, this makes so much sense.
Yeah, I know with my own daughter, I mean, she was 8, 9, 10 years old, and that I think she was we kind of came up with it about 8, but I can remember us debating on whether we wanted to tell her she had OCD or not, thinking that it could, which end of it was going to, where would it go? Would she
Mm-hmm.
take it and go, oh my God, and get, or would it help define it for her? And we decided it was better to define it, so that she didn't think she was crazy, that this was
Mm-hmm.
there was something that wasn't, I don't want to say it this way, but wasn't right with their brain, and so it
Yeah.
made, actually, I think did help her, so I agree that, how did you see it affect your family?
Yeah, it definitely affected my family. Um, the most, I would say, tangible thing, like example I can provide is I just had such a fear of harming myself, and then also of being harmed, that from, I mean, until I was in high school, my parents slept on a gymnastics mat next to my bed. And
Uh,
they talk about just how, like, how triggering it is to have your kid, they would be sleeping, and they would hear me fall asleep, and they, okay, she's breathing heavy, like, okay, she's got to be asleep, she's in a deep sleep, and they would be quietly crawling out of my room, and the second they would get to the door, they said I would just shoot up in bed and say, mom, no, mom, you can't leave.
uh,
And so, I mean, I think for probably 6 years straight that happened, and my parents just, I mean, they couldn't sleep in the same bed together because one of them was on a gymnastics mat in my room. That's like the most tangible example I can give, but I know that it just impacted so many. I mean, even if certain things changed in the house, like if something was put away differently, it would just completely set me into a tailspin. It would just be like an absolute panic. And I was going into the doctor's office constantly with assuming I had things going wrong. And we've thought about it since then. And it's just, we don't know, maybe I was having ailments or things going on, or maybe it was some sort of cry for attention. I was so young that it's hard to remember, but just the amount of time that they spent taking me to the doctor's office is so unbelievable to think about.
when you talk about your parents sleeping there on the mat, it has a lot of resemblance. It kind of sent a little chill down my, because my daughter had a tough time sleeping, and so, well, there were times when I'd have to literally hold her because she was going so crazy. I'd have to like hold her down until she passed out, and then she'd wake up 3, 4 hours later just screaming, or so yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can just really relate to that. And it's just so crazy because as a kid, I think I didn't realize the impact it had on my parents because I was just so focused on like what is going on. I just felt like I was treading water so much. And now, even just I'm not a parent, but my sister is a parent. I have a 3-year-old nephew, and I just, like, when I watch him, I think of, oh my gosh, I can't imagine if, my nephew was going through what I had been going through. As a parent, that's so much stress. And especially when you can't when your kid can't articulate what they're
Yeah.
feeling, it must have been so confusing. I had even a baby monitor in my room until I was probably 17 years old. And I remember the very first time my first high school boyfriend came over to meet my parents and have dinner at my house. and I was giving him a tour of the house and showing him the room, and my baby monitor as a 16-year-old was sitting out on my bedside table. And he said, "Why do you have a baby monitor in your room?" And I just was at a loss for words and was just so embarrassed. And I had no idea what to say. And then I think I just have so many moments like that where I was like, wow, something is really not right here, but I don't know what it is.
And I guess this leads to one thought of how did, like, that relationship with that boyfriend, how did it affect your relationships, dating relationships especially?
I dated and always was really open about the fact that I had anxiety. So I think I would have considered myself a really anxious person. I would kind of explain, occasionally I have these panic attacks, and I don't really know what they're about. It seems like they're about something really small, but it feels really big at the time. So I was very open about explaining that. But what's interesting is, I think, had you asked any boyfriend or even very close friend of mine prior to my diagnosis, if they knew that something was seriously wrong, they would say no, not at all, because I really masked it a lot. And I think that really, like, the reason I ended up having such a burnout after I started that business was I had really exacerbated my kind of trying to hide what was going on, my trying to put on my happy face all the time, because I was the face of this event conference and empowering women. And I felt like I needed to be superwoman or something and, show up for everybody and do everything. And so I came up with so many coping mechanisms that were so unhealthy because it was all masked. That still, I mean, I have a boyfriend who has been with me through my diagnosis. We've been together for 6 years. So we've been together 3 years where I hadn't been diagnosed and 3 years where I had. And he's very supportive and, kind of plays along with all my things. Most recently, I did ERP and I wasn't allowed to clean our house, which is probably so frustrating for him, given that I had been cleaning the house every single day for so long and just doing some of these compulsive behaviors. But I think that what has really been obvious is that because I was masking it for so long, I have to really, really step back. I have to journal, sit down, meditate sometimes to figure out if I feel stressed or upset or sad or any sort of strong emotion. I have to really untangle it, because for so many years, the moment I felt an emotion like that, I would mask it with something else, and it would become so convoluted that I didn't even know how I was feeling. So I'm still unraveling that today.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that my podcast is called The Invisible Wheelchair, because it's one of those things that, it can be masked it's typical for an OCD person to mask, to cover up and all of that. Plus, most people, as I look at you now, I would never know that there was anything, wrong with you. And I don't like the word wrong. I apologize for that.
Oh,
But
no.
just to know that there was something else going on, so I understand that fully. And I find it really neat that you have done something about this, that to really help others by creating your discrete journal. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, because I'm really curious. I wish I had thought about it. I would have ordered one, because I'm curious about what it is. So tell me a little bit about the journal, because I know and why you developed it.
Sure. Yeah. And I'll send you one. I love sending them to people and just getting feedback. Yeah. So discrete journal is something that I created as I was going through this therapy process since my diagnosis. And really what it was, prior to doing ERP, I was doing a lot of therapy around mindfulness and emotional regulation and stress management. And I wanted something to work on in between my therapy sessions. So I would go every week, but then in between, I kind of felt like I was in a limbo, and all I would do is, in my notepad and my phone, I would be writing down, okay, here's all the topics I'm going to bring to therapy next week. And I just felt like I could never really catch up. So I wanted something to do in between sessions. And when I went to look for some sort of mindfulness workbook or, anxiety workbook, everything that I found online said something along the lines of like, working on my depression, like in really big letters on the cover page. And my hope was I want something that I can bring to, at the time I was working in an office, to an office or a coffee shop, or if I was in school, I wanted something that I could work on and still maintain privacy. Not that it's something to hide, but that I think it should be your choice to share versus, I wouldn't want someone kind of just passing me to be like, oh, that girl is working on her depression today. And so what I ended up doing was I actually just grabbed an old notebook from my house, and I wrote out all of these really easy prompts that were, again, based on mindfulness, emotional regulation, stress management. And then I started bringing that notebook to therapy with me. And my therapist, Nicole, was so excited when I brought it. She was like, oh my gosh, I would love actually to have some of these for my clients. This is really cool. You're kind of taking what you've learned and putting it into something really tangible that someone can utilize in between sessions. And so I ended up self-publishing that and calling it Discreet Journal. So the whole concept of it is, that it can go anywhere with you. The cover of it is really private. It just says Discreet Journal. And then it has inside of it, it's a 45-day journal. But I don't necessarily like to call it 45 days because I think if you skip a few days or, use it when it's necessary, like rather than putting pressure on people. So it's 45 pages and 2 questions per page. And I also was really passionate about providing resources to, families that are lower income, because a lot of times it can be, I think one of the number one reasons people shy away from getting help is because of the expense of it. So by no means do I think people should buy the journal in exchange for, therapy. I think it's something to add on to that. And it's an inexpensive tool. So we sell them just for $8. And so, so we launched that in May of 2020 for Mental Health Awareness Month. And especially given just the circumstances of everything going on in the world right now, the response to it was so hugely positive that I actually just put out for my second print run as well. So we're really excited. People are really looking for a tool that they can use to manage their emotions. And so I hope that this will be something that can help them.
So is it different questions each day, or is it the same questions over and over?
It's different questions each day. So I have mine sitting right here. I'll read you a couple. So an example would be like, what is an emotion you often hold back? And then the second question is, when is the last time that you felt that emotion? So that would be one day. And then here's the next day. List one thing you are worried about. And then the next question is, in one sentence, write a step you can do to make it better for today. So it's really just tangible, super, super simple, easy questions to answer. And there's 45 pages of 2 questions per page.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. Because I agree with you, having something to guide you through those in between times from one therapy to another. We do ERP lessons, homework I used to call it, in between, and we still do. My second daughter is now going through some of that, so we not only had to do it once, but we've now done it twice. So
yeah.
It sounds like you could talk about this all day, I'm sure, and I would love to talk to you about it all day. But I always try to keep my things to about a half hour or so, something like that. So what I'd like to do now is just ask you is, how can they find out more about you and the journal?
Sure. So we have a website. It's just called discreetjournal.com. And so it's DISCREET journal.com. And then we're also on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest, where we just share, inspirational quotes and any updates on new journals that are coming out. And so all of those social media accounts you can find just at the handle Discreet Journal.
Well, I will also, to remind my audience, I will have this information up on the invisiblewheelchair.com website, where you can find all this good information about Sommer. And Sommer, I have to say, it's been a real pleasure to meet you and to hear your story and to know how inspirational you are to those out there, because what you're doing is just some wonderful stuff. So thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this podcast to make people feel less alone. I appreciate it.
So that is our story for this podcast. Remember, we want your story told here. If you want to tell us your success story or just want to tell us where you're at, simply go to www.invisiblewheelchair.com, then click on the Tell Us Your Story on the top left side, or just click the Contact Don button on the right side towards the bottom. We want to give you a voice to your story. Until next time, keep working on your story for a happily ever after ending.